Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Deborah Uber. I'm the Education Coordinator for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center, and we are excited to have you all here this morning and very pleased to bring you the webinar, Letting Go of Remaining Embryos. Now, before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during this session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel in the lower right-hand portion of the screen. Type your question into the dialog box and click the Send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to other attendees. We expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A, and we will be distributing a copy of today's presentation and a comprehensive list of answers to any questions submitted today during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. Just as a reminder, the presentation is being recorded today. So I'm going to go ahead and present our presenter today, Ms. Chris Probasco. Ms. Probasco has over 40 years of experience in infertility counseling, adoption experience, and also working with both embryo donors and adopters. She's the founder and CEO of Clinical Counseling Associates and established Adoption and Fertility Resources in 1993. She also established the first regional adoption agency / fertility clinic partnership in the U.S. in 2006, and she operates locally in the Kansas City area. So, Chris, I will go ahead and let you get started today. We always love having you join us, and we're excited to be able to offer this to families.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. This is such an exciting topic to be talking about, and I think it's kind of the forgotten group in terms of feelings and emotions about making a decision to place embryos. I really appreciate all the help from the staff at Snowflakes with their comments, as well as my comments to make this a grand webinar. So here we go this morning. We're going to be talking about making the decision of the outcome for frozen embryos and how difficult that decision is. And for many, many families and individuals, they are finding it more difficult than they ever thought would be before they started this whole journey. And so we're going to give a lot of thought to the process and how we can be helpful in making a good and helping making a good decision for their present and future. Next slide, please. So these are the options that was presented to all infertility couples as they're moving forward with their IVF cycle. And when they look at the forms, these words are pretty abstract. I haven't been able to make very many embryos before. Oh, we're doing an egg donor, so how many embryos could that mean? And, I'm not really even going to think about the future. I'm just going to check continuous storage and decide later, because looking at what these other decisions are very difficult. So generally, that's the first option that I think most couples choose as for their remaining embryos. Next slide, please. So what are the options? We've already looked at them and signing and saying what they're going to be doing before the IVF cycle. And usually it's much different once they've had created their embryos and put so much work and time and finances and emotions in creating the embryos, watching every step of their development, and from the follicles to the gaining of the eggs, to the creation of the embryos, to all the embryologists' comments on the growth of the embryos, and waiting for blastocyst to occur so a transfer could happen, and then the remaining embryos frozen. So there's lots of emotions and time and energy and finances that goes into creating these little embryos. Next slide, please. So the IVF cycle is never considered a lightly outcome. Most people that enter into fertility treatment think that IVF is way out there. We're never going to need that. I'm sure our doctor will be able to find something that will create a child independent of assisted reproduction. So they get to IVF being very serious about the outcome and wanting a precious child to be the outcome of that process. So the remaining embryos are really like, at that time, kind of like a bonus. So if this pregnancy doesn't work, we have embryos in the freezer that we can return to, and this just gives us many more opportunities in growing our family by having frozen embryos. So right from the start, they're very attached to the embryos that are transferred as well as the embryos that are frozen. I just visited with a family yesterday that's doing an embryo adoption, and they showed me pictures of their embryos they were able to create, however, not a successful pregnancy, and those embryos are still very dear to them, and they still feel a loss that they weren't able to continue to grow. Next slide, please. So the options, continue to storage. And like I said before, that most couples check that box, and if they're asked to check other boxes, then usually what I'm seeing is thaw and discard. And again, this is before any of the embryos or the stimulation is done. So it's before the embryos are created. So the feelings about the embryos at that time, or the creation of the embryos, is more abstract. It's more words on the page than having attachment and feelings connected not only to their creation, but their potential life and their future. So we do have some information about the length of time that embryos can be stored. Generally, it's 4 to 5 years before a decision is made if there's going to be for the outcome of the embryos. But there has been documentation that children have been born from embryos that have been frozen for over 20 years. Now, that's a long shelf life for these little embryos, but it just shows that the technique has been good all along. I think the technique for freezing embryos is even more improved. Early embryos were frozen mainly at day 3 of development, and now they go to day 5 or 6, which is the blastocyst stage, which has many more cells contributing to the life of the embryo. Some physician offices store the embryos for their patients, especially if they state that they're going to come back for them for another child, or they may have transfer the embryos to long-term storage. As there's several in the country that store embryos for a variety of fertility practices. Regardless of where they're stored, there is a storage fee every year that is requested to continue the storage, and that's kind of a time that people start thinking more about, oh, okay, another year of payment, and what am I going to do with these embryos? So that's getting the bill kind of starts some of the thinking for their that needs some of the thinking that is needed for their decision. Next slide, please. Thaw and discard. This is very, very difficult once the embryos are made. Before they were made, it was, well, these are a group of cells. Now when the embryos have been made and you are parenting their siblings, for the lack of a better description, it's a much more of an attachment process to these potential lives. And some families do decide to allow them to be discarded in the fertility practice. Some ask for the embryos to be given to them in a little vial so they can have basically a burial service for them. And then some do what's called a compassionate transfer, where the embryos are transferred to the parent, the mother parent of the embryos during the time in her cycle where conception could not happen. So there's a variety of ways to do the thaw and discard. However, it is destroying the life of the embryo. Next slide, please. Donate to science. This has been a really hot potato, shall we say, in the political world. We do know that there are research for embryos stem cell. Really hasn't advanced as much as the scientists say they thought it would, and really haven't had as much breakthrough of embryo stem cell curing this disease or that disease. So it's still in the research process, and there are some facilities that do research on embryos, and the reproductive endocrinologist office can help in referring you to those facilities. Next slide, please. Donate to another couple. Boy, when people see that to begin with, they have this kind of knee-jerk reaction of those are my embryos and I'm going to use them, and I created them. I created them either with egg donation or sperm donation or through our own genetics. And to donate to another couple, that just really sounds kind of bizarre and this is, again, before you make the embryos. However, I think a lot of families that really discuss this in detail before they're signing the forms and checking the boxes may have a kind of a head start on what this could mean for another family. So the thinking process is there. However, decision-making comes much later in trying to figure out what's best for them. By donating their embryos to another infertile couple, they are continuing the potential life of those embryos, and they were made to be parented, and this, by the donation process, this is allowing them to have parents on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So in the decision to donate, we're going to focus on that decision because we are talking about embryo adoptions. There's many things that draw a couple to the decision to place their embryos. Perhaps their family is complete. The first process of IVF with 2 embryos transferred, they got twins, and they are beyond having their family. Or they went back for their remaining embryos, and the ones they thought was successful, and now they have a family or 2 or 3 or 4, and definitely their family is complete, and there remains additional embryos. There are some couples that are physically or emotionally unable to transfer remaining embryos, and they decide not to use a surrogate. So then they look at their circumstances that they're not able to bring those embryos to their home, but they can allow the embryos to be parented by another family. Unexpected circumstances, and this does happen, such as death or divorce, and there are the forms that they sign that if this happens, what they will do. But again, they do have the right to continue to make the decision. Families that were in the process of perhaps an adoption, or they have a mission to care for foster children, and they're parenting their children through the IVF process, may decide to allow those embryos to be placed with another family, as they also are an adoptive family or are foster parents for children. Next slide, please. So why choose to place the embryos with another family? I think the strong motivation is to continue their life. These are families that, for the most part, these are families that believe life begins at conception, and they want to be able to continue their lives in the best possible situation. They also have a deep empathy for others that have struggled in infertility. They have more of a match of mature adults working with mature adults, people like themselves, people that have struggled with infertility, and without perhaps embryo donation or adoption, they may not be able to have a child through their own birth process. So that their personal experience really has an impact on their thinking about placing. Also, that they created all of these embryos to be parented. I've heard that several times, that we wanted to parent these embryos. However, there were too many, and these embryos deserve a chance to have parents that are ready for them and ready to provide a good, solid home for them. However, this comes from much thinking, much grief and feelings before they can get to the spot of this is best for the embryos rather than what's best necessarily for us. This is going to cause some discomfort and pain, and what will the future bring? So there's lots and lots of what ifs when people talk about placing their embryos, which then becomes a grief process for them. Next slide, please. So why is the decision-making difficult? I think, we've been talking about that. There is an attachment process that people experience, whether it's through egg donation or sperm donation and or their own genetics, of the development of these embryos. They are sacred to them. They feel that they have worked so hard for their creation, and they have a need for them to make the decision, because they don't want the embryos in storage forever. And they realize, as they're thinking about the emotions that come up to this, and it's kind of uncommon to think about grieving the loss of potential children through embryo placement, but really it's kind of the same kind of thing that we used to do in adoption. With birth families, we told them to go away and forget about this, that this isn't really important. This is a child you're not able to parent. And, our adoption history taught us that no one went away thinking that I wouldn't think about this again. And it's the same kind of situation for genetic families that are trying to make the decision for placement. We don't concentrate, I think, enough on their emotions, and they're very surprised about the emotions that they have, but these are pretty common, and if we can put this in a grief process, then they can understand what they're experiencing. Next slide, please. So the emotions that may surface, now they may be surprised that some of the emotions that surface are common to where they were years ago in infertility. The anger and the sorrow and the frustration of being infertile, and now the anger and sorrow and frustration of having to make this difficult decision. So it could be repeat feelings that they are experiencing, and could actually have more power to them because it's an additional grief reaction they did not anticipate. They also have worries of the unknown, fear of the unknowns, concerned about legal implications, and really getting to good people to discuss all of these what-ifs and concerns can be very helpful. Information and education can be an enlightening process in trying to make the difficult decision. They don't want their children to feel that they were abandoned or unwanted. Again, another adoption feeling from the past. They feel the sadness of not being able to raise this child. And they also have the fear of, where will this child go? Will I see them in a crowd? All of the what-ifs that really is a hard grief process, but fits the situation. Next slide, please. Processing, trying to figure it out. We did talk about the information and the education and how embryo adoption can be actually a wonderful process where you feel that you're involved in the process, you're making your own decisions. So placing embryos with a facility like Snowflakes, which treats this like an adoption, that they're able to be able to choose their family, be able to know about the family, know about the process, and really celebrate the birth of this child and know the significance that this child will bring to another family. Lots and lots of issues, of course. Nothing is thought-free in this process, and perhaps the help from a mental health professional to sort through the feelings and lead to a decision, and really to be aware of what choices are available in making the decision for donation. Next slide, please. So when there is donor egg or donor sperm involved, I see more couples go into the phase of paying forward, that we had help to create our family, and our children are wonderful, and we wouldn't trade them in for anything. And we had individuals or another family that helped us in creating this child, and honoring their help by allowing another family to parent the remaining embryos is really a good thought for them, and it's a thought that is very positive and helps them get through all the issues and emotions that they will experience in the placement process. This also brings up for the family with donor egg or sperm is the telling process. So usually, again, the embryos are 4 to 5 years old, and this is the time that we recommend that children start learning about, more concrete learning about their creation and their genetic connection to another family. So this may stir up more of, okay, now it's time for me to be thinking about that, as well as I'm thinking about letting go of my embryos. So it can be a very difficult sorting out, shall we say, of all the emotions involved with this process. We also would want the information that's provided on the donor egg and sperm to be given to the adoptive family, so that can be part of their telling story. The adoptive family will have a lot more training, shall we say, about the telling to the children, because they've gone through an adoptive home study, and this is one of the areas that they will be educated on and be prepared to talk to the child. So the donating family hasn't had that experience with the home study and such, and counseling and education mostly. So this issue of the telling then comes up at that time. Next slide, please. When IVF, this is a difficult one, and I've worked with these situations just a couple times. When the IVF was unsuccessful with the intended parents, but they had remaining embryos, and what to do with those remaining embryos when they themselves are in a situation where they cannot parent together, or there's been a death in the family, or a serious divorce situation, and custody issues around the embryos. There's just so much that the news has brought us about custody issues and factors that lead to we weren't able to parent these embryos, and we're not able to parent these embryos. But again, we are committed to their life and want them to be placed with another family. The conflict, especially if there was a divorce, boy, there's lots and lots of conflict between the couples. They usually do go back to what did we sign before we created these embryos, which in no way represents their current thinking. So mediation could be helpful in trying to decide, again, and choosing a family so they know what has happened to these embryos, and that their work and their hard work in making the decision to place the embryos will be forever known to the child by the adoptive family, and they will always be part of that child's story. So again, a very difficult situation requires lots of counseling, perhaps even legal consideration as they're making the decision. Next slide, please. So getting on the same page with a partner. So we see in the news, of course, when there's a disagreement for the legal issues of one wants to parent and one does not. So getting in the same book is important, and then trying to get at least in the same chapter, and then maybe close to the same page would be significant. Where I see the differences for couples is not necessarily in their desires to place the embryos, but what kind of placement are they desiring, what kind of contact would they like with the adoptive family, and there can be a difference of opinion with that. And so that could be a difficult situation in trying to figure out. Could take some counseling sessions, could take more education, and maybe just be with, okay, we made the decision, we want to place the embryos, we got that done, and now we're working on the details of how to make it successful. And again, that is a process, takes time, dedication, and maybe even some marital consideration, and marital therapy could be even additionally helpful in trying to both of you realize the decision you need to make, and there is a compromise in terms of what the details are going to be for that decision. Next slide, please. Who's impacted? Boy, this is another kind of glaring recognition of what's all involved. So definitely individually, it really hurts your soul to think that you're not able to care for all the biological children that you created. It's didn't think I'd be in this situation. It's kind of, I love the children I'm parenting. I wouldn't trade them in for anything, but now I have too many. And how am I going to settle myself that I wasn't able to parent all the embryos, but another family was? Again, as a couple, making a mutual decision that really is very important. So as a couple, you will look back on this and say, we did the hard work. We made definite decisions that was going to be helpful for our child, for our children, and for our children in the future. And we feel good about it. Genetic siblings, I think this is really the wild card out there. We've learned from the Donor Sibling Registry, which now has over 50,000 registrants, that families and kids are interested in connecting to other genetic kin. And the registry has success every day in matching families with other families that have used the same donor. We also know this in adoption, that when adoptees are beginning the search process, that's the first question they ask: do I have any siblings? yeah, I'm interested in my birth mother, of course. I'm interested in my birth father, but do I have any siblings? That's the main focus of the beginning of the focus in search and reunion. And the potential child, they're going to have a grand story, a story to celebrate, that they had two families that loved them a great deal. One family loved them and created them. Another family is their day-to-day parents. And without both families, they wouldn't be able to reach their potential and be a successful human being. Next slide, please. So what does the grief look like? I think it really is telling when we look at the average amount of time that it takes to make a decision, and it is usually about 4 to 5 years before families come up to say we've got these embryos in storage for long enough. We need to have a decision made. And 4 to 5 years of thinking about it, talking about it, it's a long time to have that be out there for a decision, a needed decision. So when feelings come up as they're thinking and processing that, it may be too difficult to process, or they don't have a way to process, and so they stop the thinking and, well, we'll decide about that later. I think that's what happens when they receive the bill in the mail. Oh dear, we got to pay that storage again, and we need to make a decision. Okay, we'll pay the storage, and then we'll figure things out later. But later that does catch up to folks, and they want their embryos, if they are going to place, to have as much success as possible, and really looking at their attachment to the embryos and the letting go is a grief process, and we need to recognize it as a grief process. Again, in our adoption history, we did not really recognize the grief of birth mothers in placing their children. We used to basically, they would give birth, they wouldn't even know if it was a boy or girl, and then they would say, sign this and go on and live your life. A lot of those birth moms that we talk to today are still grieving the loss of the unknown, the loss of the what-ifs, and will I ever meet this child? Will this child want to know about me? You know, we can settle all of those what-ifs with a very good decision that takes everybody into account of what is best. Next slide, please. So denial is, I think, we live in the denial with frozen embryos for years, and you're really detached from your feelings. These are more, that's when the thinking of, well, they're just cells goes into thought, or you may hear other people say, well, what's the big deal? They're just a bunch of cells. Well, for you, the big deal is that these embryos, for the most part, created our children, and our children are a big deal. They are our future. They're our family. And these embryos that we are so attached to also represents future. But we have to get beyond the denial of the feelings to the actual reality of the feelings. And it never feels good to be in grief. It has lots of aches and pains, shall we say, both emotionally and can be physically. Frustration and thoughts of am I making the right decision? What about the remaining children? What about my children? You know, all of this is so complicated. So what story do you want to have for your child? Do you want to have the story that my first family faced all of their emotions in their decision to place me, and they freely gave me to my adoptive family? They wanted my adoptive family to be my day-to-day parents, and I appreciate all the work they did in creating me, as well as the hard work in letting me go. Next slide, please. The depression part. Oh, boy, yeah. Can't even get when you're in the heart of that decision-making and you know you have to make it, and you've waited long enough and denial has broken, then the feelings of loss will definitely be there. If you've shared with other families, they may have their thoughts and feelings on it. You're worried about the child. You don't want them to feel abandoned, and you're worried about your children. Don't want them to think that we can let go of them also. So it's just a stir up of feelings and emotions that are difficult. And oftentimes feeling the sadness and the depression from that fits the situation. And we need to be very supportive of families that are going through this. They need tender, loving care. They need the recognition of the importance of these embryos and what they represent to them. They represented future, and they continue to represent future, however, not being raised in their family. Next slide, please. The acceptance. Okay, all righty. We've recognized, we've been supported, we've been encouraged, we understand, we accept that our job is a hard job to do. However, we have the ability to choose a family for these embryos. We have the ability to know how things are going, know about the transfer, know about the successful pregnancy, know about how the pregnancy is going, know when the child is born, get pictures or have communication. So that child is not lost to us. That child is a gain for another family, and it's also a gain for us because we know that difficult decision has resulted in this child's continued life and then being parented by very, very important people. Next slide, please. Finding peace with the situation. Now, I know you can't get 100% peaceful. It just doesn't happen with anything. But if you can feel mostly peaceful with the situation, I mean, for everybody, their druthers were that they didn't have to go through infertility, that they didn't have to face this decision. That would be their druthers, but that's years ago. So we find the peace of knowing that we gave the continued gift of life to the children we created, and these children continue to thrive and in their raising family. And we are very proud of them. We're proud of their accomplishments. We know that we know what's going on. We see pictures. So the open placement, I think, is so important in letting go of the grief because you have a place to put joy. And joy really, hopefully, is at the end of grief, that you've had found peace and you know that their well-being is of utmost importance, not only to them but to their raising family, and they have all the opportunities that you had hoped for them. I think in choosing a closed situation, it still gives you closure that you have made the decision. However, it doesn't give you the opportunities to know how the child is doing. Next slide, please. So what are adoptive families like? I love this picture. This is a good one. You know, they're people just like yourselves that have struggled with infertility, that have the desire to be pregnant, and that it's not possible for them. So they're just like you. They're emotionally stable, and they've been vetted, shall we say. So the social workers in their lives have trained them, have taught them, and they know a lot about how to be a successful adoptive family and a successful adoptive family through an embryo adoption. When a genetic family is choosing an adoptive family, most times they choose somebody just like themselves, where they have the same activities and maybe the same infertility diagnosis, and so they feel really connected to them. And in some ways, they are family together because they both love the same child, and how that family has contact is really part of the decision-making and part of the growth of the relationship as the child is born and continues to grow. The good thing is that you still have an ability to contact each other for medical emergencies or emotional situations, and then just to find out how things are going. The adoptive family has an enormous amount of gratitude that they were able to receive a child through an embryo placement, and they were able to grow a pregnancy and give birth and be somewhat normal, I guess, in that situation, but also to meet that child from their very beginnings and to be able to take care of them right from the start. And the start is at transfer. Next slide, please. The hope in embryo adoption, of course, is a successful birth and the opportunity to raise a child. There are lots of embryo placements going on, and we love hearing all the stories. I know there's been a lot more stories in the news in the last year, and the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center can keep you posted on all that goes on. We also know that children are curious, and children want to know about their first family, the family that created them. So having the contact is good for everyone around. But that also means that the grief process has been successful for the genetic family as well as the adoptive family. We've done a couple webinars on grieving the loss of a genetic child. The adults all need to do their work in order for the children to thrive within their families. Children should not be born into a family where there's a job for them, a job to fix their infertility, or a job to fix their marriage, or a job to bring life into a family. Their job is to be children, to be free, to discover themselves, and to know where they came from, and all of the ingredients from both families. Children can figure this out. We know this from adoption of years and years. It just takes a lot of explaining and understanding and pictures and recognizing the hope for the future that both families are dedicated to. Next slide, please. Who benefits from the openness? For the genetic family, all the what-ifs that they were struggling with in the decision-making, what if they're not good parents? What if they haven't been screened appropriately? What if I run into the child in the mall and they're at the shopping center, and will I be looking at all kids about the age of when I let go of the embryo? All of that is gone. It's not there because they have the knowledge and they have the understanding of where their child is raised, what's going on in the family, if they have more children. I mean, the child can grow up knowing what their biological family is about currently, not just in paperwork of 3 or 4 years ago, and they can have a really good understanding of their first family as well as an understanding of their raising family. And their job, their big job, is to form an identity. And we've all gone through that identity development. And for an adopted person, it has extra layers. And the more they know about their families, their families that created them, and the family and how they're doing as a family now, and know about their biological siblings, they have that knowledge that they can take apart and put back together and form an identity that is true to themselves. And I think we need to remember as we're going through this that kids want to know their genetic kin, and we can't deny that. 95% of all infant adoptions are open adoption, and I think with adoption agencies that are doing embryo adoption, we probably have close to that percentage also. So we've learned from the past, and we're going to take what we have learned that has been beneficial into the future in preparing both the genetic family and the adoptive family for this process and hopefully the birth of a child. Next slide, please. So embryo adoption is a selfless decision. Once we go through all the grief and figure out, okay, this is all about a child. This is about the child's well-being. And we created embryos that created children, and we want to allow those embryos to be raised in a family that wants them so dearly and will love them. They will be precious little people. They will instruct the child about all of who they are. They will work hard to make them successful, and we can be proud of the children we are parenting, as well as the child that is part of who we are and being raised in another family. Next slide, please. And here we are.
Thank you so much, Chris. I love that you were able to join us to talk about this subject. It's so important.
More than welcome.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and just open it up for any questions. We have the instructions right here for how to submit them, as we had them a little bit earlier. If you just had any questions that came up during the webinar or anything that you would like to ask about embryo donation in general, we would be happy to help with some answers for that. And while we are letting you have some time to fill out any questions, I'm going to give you some information about some upcoming events that you might be interested in. Just a little bit later this month, actually next week, again on Wednesday, January 13th, we're going to have a webinar that has 3 families joining us, sharing their personal stories about embryo adoption. So if you're interested in finding out more about the adoptive families when it comes to embryo adoption, we have those 3 families joining us, and they're just going to share their experience, what they have, their trials, anything that, the excitement, of course, and everything that they really want to share about their story when it comes to coming into embryo adoption and having children from embryo adoption as well. And then later on in the month, we have Embryo Donation and Adoption Open Mic Night. This is going to be an evening webinar, and we'll just be giving a little bit of information about the process for embryo donation and adoption, but then we open it up for any questions. So if you have any further questions you didn't think to ask during this webinar, you can always join during this time and ask those questions at that point, and it's also really helpful just to join, because sometimes families will come up with questions that you may not have even thought of, and we'll be answering any of those. So we would love to have you join us for that, and you can register at embryoadoption.org if you would like to join those webinars as well. Looks like we do have one question that came in, and it is, how open are most adoptive families to visits with the genetic family or genetic siblings?
Okay. So usually the relationship that's developed between the genetic family and the adoptive family looks like something that people are already doing in their families. So it may be like an aunt and uncle relationship or a cousin relationship. You know where each other is at. You may have contact once or twice a year. You may get together for a gathering. It may be, it will be something that people are familiar with, which I think is good for folks to know. It's not the show up at the door and knock on the door and show, here I am kind of thing. We're talking about 2 sets of mature adults that want the best for their kids and want to recognize how their families are unique and their families have a connection together. So it's really about how do we honor and respect that connection in terms of contact that's good for everybody. So you may have contact 2 or 3 times in a year, and you may not only once the next year. So again, if you can think about the similarities between relatives that you have, really is kind of the conclusion that you will have with a relationship in an open placement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the Snowflakes program specifically, when they're looking to find an adoptive family and working to match you with an adoptive family, they're going to take those preferences into consideration as well. So if you're really wanting visits to be a possibility, they're going to work to match you with an adoptive family that has that same mentality and they're comfortable with having visits. So if that's something that you're really comfortable with and really wanting and desiring in a relationship, that's definitely a possibility.
We do finalized adoptions here in Kansas City, so I get to do my favorite thing and go visit families. And I just came from visiting a family that's in an embryo adoption, and they received this wonderful package via Snowflakes from their genetic family. And it was different outfits that was made for their daughter. And the material that they were made out of was material that they had used for some of the outfits for their children, and it just had such a special connection that the adoptive mom said, these will be kept forever. And I'm going to put her in each outfit and take a picture and send it on to the genetic family so they can know how much we appreciate their connection. And so, really cool things can happen. And in a closed situation, we wouldn't be able to have that wonderfulness.
Mm-hmm. All right, the next question that came in, how long should you expect to wait to be matched with a family that wants as much openness as possible? And I can answer this for Snowflakes if you don't have a specific answer. So with the Snowflakes program, the matching process usually lasts in between 1 to 4 months. If it's just that you're hoping for an open relationship and you don't have a bunch more specific requirements that you're hoping for the adoptive family, then you could still expect to be matched within that time frame, I would expect. There's just a lot more that goes into it than just the openness, but that is one of the main considerations. And I know that with adoptive families, they are very well educated about the benefits of an open relationship, and so they do have families that are available looking for visits and as much openness as possible. Okay. Let me scroll down. I have another one. What are some ways in which the adoptive family explains the genetic parents and siblings to the adopted children? And how do some of the adopted children address the genetic families as aunts, uncles, friends, etc.?
Okay. So the aunts, uncles, friends, associate, I don't want that to get confused that you would refer to the genetic family as aunts and uncles or cousins. It's just a like relationship. So, kids can really, they're concrete thinkers. They can really hear right from the very start that there was another family that helped create you, and even get pictures of the embryos, they as embryos, and this is how you started before you were given into mommy's body. And we know a lot about that family. There's pictures about that family, and you're going to be curious about them from time to time, and that's okay. All questions are welcomed. We just need you to know how your beginnings began. And it's a cause of celebration rather than a cause of being fearful or scared, that these are good people. These are people that are parenting all the children they can, or decided not to proceed with caring for the embryos. So they know right from the start that there's significant others that they're connected to. And then it's their job to take the information and develop understanding and acceptance. And, that takes 18, 20 years to get that all done. So it's not an overnight process. And we did do a webinar maybe a couple of years ago about talking to the child about donor conceptions. So I don't know if that's still available to listen to, but that may be a good webinar for this questioner to look at.
Yeah, and I can include a link. We have that on the webinar archives page at the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center website, and so I can include a link to that in the follow-up email.
Okay, great, great, great.
All right, I do not see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead. Oh, wait, someone just got one in there. All right, last question. I regard fears that genetic families have. I am more afraid of donating the embryos and never hearing from the adoptive family again. So I think she just wants to have that addressed.
Yeah, of course you are. You know, and that's one of the fears going into the process. I think the process will help because you will be choosing your family, and then that family will choose you back, and then you have a social connection before you go forward with the legal process as well as the medical process. So it's during that social development that you can be having a connection with the adoptive family. And I think you need to remember that the adoptive family has been trained. There's a lot of us out there that are really training them that the genetic family are forever going to be connected to this child, and it's their job to figure out a way to respect and honor them. And developing a relationship is one way to secure that you will be knowing how things are going.
Yes, and it's also beneficial when you're working with an agency that even in situations though the agreements have already been made for what contact's going to look like, if something is to happen, if they fall off the face of the earth, so to speak, or haven't been in contact much lately, you're also going to have, at least in terms of snowflakes, you're going to have that agency to help out with that and to try and get in contact with the family and see what's going on, and even in some cases mediate, which is not very, usually isn't necessary, but it's definitely there just in case if something like that were to happen. So you at least have that added benefit when you're working with an agency that they're there to work with you and they're not going to forget about you after the donation process has actually taken place. Okay.
Good.
Looks like one more question. Do you take embryos for donation prior to matching with adoptive parents, and does that cost the patient and donating couple anything? And again, I can speak to Snowflakes on this one. With their process specifically, it does depend on the adoption agency that you're working with. But with Snowflakes, they will not take the embryos specifically for that donation. Actually, they will stay in your ownership until the point that you've already selected a family and contracts have been gone over and that kind of information has been chosen. So they stay in your property until you have selected that family, you've agreed on all of the contact, and then the contracts are written, in which case they go over to the adoptive family's property. So Snowflakes will never take ownership of the embryos themselves. And so the actual cost to donate, there is no cost for that. The only cost you might want to consider is the storage costs that would be associated to storing the embryos up to the point where the adoptive family takes over. And Snowflakes does have a new storage program available that will allow you to get free storage for 12 months while you're in the donation process and while you're donating your embryos. So I would be happy to address those questions. If you want to email me after I send out the follow-up email, you'll have my email address then.
Great, great. And then I do a lot of direct placements where people find their own families, and the same is true, that the embryos remain in their custody until there is contracts designed and developed, and then they're transferred to the clinic where the adoptive family, usually to where the adoptive family has their physicians.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think that is all of the questions, and it looks like we're right on time with things, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and close everything up. If you ended up thinking of any questions after the webinar or didn't get anything answered, you can always join us again for the Embryo Donation and Adoption Open Mic Night, or you can always email me after I send the follow-up email, and I can answer you that way. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Chris, for presenting today. We really appreciate it.
More than welcome. I always enjoy doing this. I have a smile on my face when I know it's webinar day.
All right. Thank you so much. Everybody have a great day.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.